Study Session 7: Economic Growth, Poverty and Inequality. Introduction. In this study session, you will explore the concept of economic growth. We will as well draw a demarcation line between this concept and a related concept, that is, economic development. The concept of poverty and inequality will also be discussed. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Draw a demarcation line between economic development and economic growth. 2. Point out the problems associated with using GDP per capita as a surrogate for economic growth. 3. Explain the conceptual issues involved in poverty and inequality. 4. Measure level of poverty. 5. Point out the causes and the effects of poverty. 6. Discuss how to eliminate poverty. Economic growth and development. The word economic growth is often used interchangeably with economic development. There is, however, a distinction between the two concepts. Economic growth refers to a sustained increase in the productive capacity of a country, that is, expansion in output or national output, while economic development occurs when a country experiences three main phenomena, namely structural changes, institutional changes, and changes in the national output of a nation. From the foregoing, it suffices that economic growth is a subset of economic development. Generally speaking, economic growth refers to the increasing ability of a nation to produce more goods and services. Growth can occur in two different ways. 1. Through an intensive and increased use of factors of production, e.g., like land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial resources by using better technology or management techniques. And 2. Through increased productivity of existing resources or via rising labor and capital productivity. Theoretically, having an increasing national output means greater material welfare and a rise in the living standard of the people. It does not necessarily mean to have higher levels of well-being for all individuals in the country. As a matter of fact, economic growth can have negative impact on a nation, which could include environmental degradation and loss of traditional cultural values. It may also lead to a greater inequality between different classes of people in the society. That is, it may widen the gap between the rich and the poor. Problems associated with using GDP per capita as a growth measure. GDP per capita is obtained when gross domestic national product is deflated by the total number of people in a country. The use of GDP as a growth measure is fraught with the following problems. 1. GDP per capita does not provide any information relevant to the income distribution in a country. 2. GDP per capita does not take into account negative externalities from pollution consequent to the growth witnessed. 3. GDP per capita does not also take into account positive externalities that may result from services like education, health, and number 4, GDP per capita exclude the value of both economic and non-economic activities that take place outside the marketplace, such as cost-free leisure activities like cycling. Owing to these identified problems and limitations, various indicators have been developed to compensate for such limitations of economic growth measurement. The main development indicator used is the Human Development Index. It was developed by United Nations Development Programme (UNDP) to measure the economic achievement in combining growth as well as social welfare. The HDI measures the average achievement in a country in the three basic dimensions of human development. Hence, it is a comparative measure for countries worldwide. The three basic dimensions of human development include: number one, a long and healthy life as measured by life expectancy at birth. 2. Knowledge as measured by adult literacy rate. 3. A decent standard of living as measured by GDP per capita. Human Development Index is essentially a score between 0 and 1. A score of 0 would mean no human development has taken place, and a score of 1 is the maximum amount of human development. Thus, it is possible, however, that a nation may have a higher GDP per capita ranking than its HDI ranking. This simply suggests that there is a very high level of inequality. That is, high income levels are taken and enjoyed by a small proportion of the population, as we have in Nigeria. The UNDP has also developed a number of other indicators. It has developed a specific Gender Development Index and Human Poverty Index. While the former is measured, which shows gender inequality in economic and political opportunity, the latter, on the other hand, measures and examines the extent of the disadvantages faced by people who have been deprived of human development. Thus, it measures using the percentage of people expected to die before age 40, a percentage of illiterate adults, the percentage of people without access to health services and safe water, and the percentage of underweight children under 5 years. Problems associated with using GDP as a growth measure. 1. Its non-provision of information relevant to the income distribution in a country. 2. It does not take into account negative externalities from pollution consequent to the economic growth. 3. It does not also take into account positive externalities that may result from services like education and health. 4. It excludes value for economic and non-economic activities that take place outside the marketplace. Poverty and inequality. Income inequality is the existence of disproportionate distribution of total national income among households, whereby the share going to the rich in a country is far greater than the share going to the poor. This is largely due to differences in the amount of income derived from ownership of property, and to a lesser extent, the result of differences in earned income. Income inequality can bring about poverty in a society. Poverty is not just caused by individual experiences, but by major inequalities built into the structure of the society. Poverty is a relative concept used to describe a people in a society that cannot participate in the activities that most people take for granted. Poverty is understood in many senses. The main understanding of the term include: number one, description of material need, typically including the necessities of daily living, that is, food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare. Poverty in this sense may be understood as the deprivation of essential goods and services. Number 2, description of social relationship and need, including social exclusion, dependency, and the ability to participate in society. This will include education and information. 3, description of a lack of sufficient income and wealth. The meaning of sufficient income and health varies widely across the different political and economic parts of the world. Poverty may be seen as the collective condition of a group of poor people or of poor groups, or sometimes the entire nation state may be regarded as poor. To avoid stigma, these nations are usually called developing nations. When measured, poverty may be absolute or relative. Measure of poverty. 1. Absolute income criteria. Absolute poverty refers to a set of standards which is consistent over time and between countries. Absolute measures define a minimum standard and then calculate the number of individuals that fall below this threshold, that is baseline. When an individual falls below this baseline, it means poverty is in place. These methods are most useful when determining the amount of poverty in a society. Examples include A. Poverty line. This is a measure of the level of income necessary for subsistence in a society. It varies from place to place and from time to time, depending on the cost of living and people's expectation. It is usually defined by government and calculated as that level of income at which a household would devote 2/3 of its income to basic necessities such as food, water, shelter, and clothing. B. Poverty line or poverty index. This index was developed by Amartya Sen. It takes into account both the number of people and the extent of their poverty. Sen defined the index as 1 equals P over N bracket B minus A over A, where P represents the number of people below the poverty line, N the total number of people in the society, B represent the poverty line income, and A average income of those below the poverty line. Other indicators of absolute poverty include life expectancy and child mortality. Relative income criteria. Relative poverty views poverty as socially defined and dependent on social context. In this case, the number of people counted poor will increase while their income rises. The relative measurement will be to compare the total wealth of the poorest 1/3 of a population with the total wealth of the richest 1% of the population. Thus, relative income measures compare the income of one individual or group with the income of another individual or group. These measures are most useful when analyzing the scope and distribution of income inequality. Percentile distribution. One percentile is compared to another. For example, it might be determined that the income of the top 10 percentile is only slightly more than the bottom 40 percentile. Individuals are usually arranged by ascending personal incomes and then divide the total population into distinct groups or sizes. A common method is to divide the population into successive quintile or decile according to ascending income levels, and then determine what proportion of the total income is received by each income group. The table below shows the hypothetical but fairly typical distribution of income for a developing country. Distribution of personal income in a developing country. In table 7.1, 20 individuals or more, commonly households, representing the entire population of the country, are arranged in order of ascending annual income, ranging from the individual with the lowest income, 0.8 units, to the one with the highest income, 15.0 units. The total or national income of all individuals amounts to 100 units, and it's the sum of all entries in column 2. In column 3, the population is grouped into quintiles of 4 individuals each. The first quintile represents the bottom 20 of the population on the income scale. This group receives only 5% of the total national income. The second quintile, individuals 5 to 8, receives 9% of the total income. Alternatively, the bottom 40 of the population is receiving only 14% of the income, while the top 20 percentage, fifth quartile of the population, receives 51% of the total income. The common measure of income equality that can be derived from column 3 is the ratio of the income received by the top 20% and the bottom 40 of the population. This ratio, sometimes called Kuznets ratio after the Nobel laureate Simeon Kuznets, is often used as a measure of the degree of income inequality between the two extremes of very poor and very rich in the country. This income inequality ratio is equal to 51 divided by 14, that is approximately 3.64. To provide a more detailed breakdown of the size distribution of income, decile shares are listed in column 4. The bottom 10% of the population is receiving only 1% of the total income, while the top 10 receives 28.5% of the total population. Finally, if we want to know what the total 5% receives, we would divide the total population into 20 equal groups of individuals and calculate the percentage of total income received by the top group. For example, we can see that the top 5% of the population, that is 28 individual, receives 15% of the income, a higher share than the combined share of the lowest 40%. At every point of the diagonal, the percentage of income received is exactly equal to the percentage of income recipient. For example, the point halfway along the length of the diagonal represents 50% of the income being distributed to exactly 50% of the population. At the 3/4 point on the diagonal, 75% of the income would be distributed to 75% of the population. In other words, the diagonal line is representative of perfect equality in size distribution of income. Each percentage group of income recipient is receiving that same percentage of the total income. For example, the bottom 40 receives 40% of the income, while the top 5% receives only 5% of the total income. The Lorenz curve is plotted using the decile data. Both the horizontal and vertical axes have been divided into 10 equal segments corresponding to each of the 10 decile groups. Group A shows that the bottom 10 of the population receives only 1.8% of the total income. Point B shows that the bottom 20 is receiving 5% of the total income, and so on for each group of the 8 cumulative decile groups. At the halfway point, 50% of the population is receiving only 19.8% of the total income. The more the Lorenz line curves away from the diagonal, the greater the degree of income inequality represented. This will represent a relatively equal distribution, and the others represent a relatively unequal distribution. Therefore, the greater the inequality, the closer to the bottom horizontal axis the Lorenz curve will be. However, the Lorenz curve suffers from some technical drawback. It is incapable of any negative incomes. It is insensitive to errors of measurement and cannot distinguish between location of inequality within the saved income range. The Gini coefficient. Instead of graphical representation, the Gini coefficient offers a neat numerical way of summarizing the message in a Lorenz curve. The Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality of distribution. The Gini coefficient is defined as a ratio between 0 and 1, where incomes are distributed perfectly equally. The Gini coefficient is 0. On the other, and where incomes are distributed perfectly unequally, the Gini coefficient is 1. Gini coefficient can be derived as follows: G equals 10,000 minus summation percentage of income received multiplied by cumulative income received, everything over 1,000. Eliminating poverty. 1. Economic growth, but must be accompanied by progressive distributional change. 2. Direct aid. Government can directly help those in need. 3. Improving the social environment and abilities of the poor, that is, affordable housing, education, affordable healthcare, subsidizing the unemployed group. 4. Providing help and generating employment. Summary. In this study session, we considered economic growth as a subset of economic development. We noted that there are problems associated with using GDP per capita as a growth measure. We also conceptualized poverty as either being absolute or relative. Poverty could be caused by lack of freedom and social oppression, or absence of an infrastructure, government corruption, crime, natural disaster, overpopulation, and lack of education, to mention a few. We'll conclude the study session by presenting ways through which poverty can be controlled. These include economic growth with progressive distributional change, government's direct aid, improving the social environment and abilities of the poor. This is the end of study session 7. Thanks for listening.